Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So, I want you to imagine walking into a room full of the brightest scientific minds of our generation.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. And you stand there and tell them that you have cracked the code to biological immortality.
Oh, man. They'd love that.
Yeah, but not through medicine, not through like gene editing or some new tech. You tell them you cracked it because a first-century carpenter walked out of his own grave.
Yeah, you would be laughed right out of the building.
Got on, they would just show you the door. And the crazy thing is, 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece, the Apostle Paul experienced that precise scenario.
He really did.
So today we were doing a deep dive into an August 1738 sermon by Jonathan Edwards. It's titled Jesus Christ, Gloriously Exalted Above All Evil in the Work of Redemption.
That is quite the title.
It is, and the text he uses is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 25 and 26. And what Edwards does here is build this massive theological architecture regarding the complete subjugation of every single form of evil.
Yeah, the sheer scale of the problem, as Edwards saw it, is, frankly, terrifying.
Truly terrifying. And the absolute supremacy of his proposed solution is staggering. So you're going to want to pay close attention to this one, because this deep dive dissects what is basically a cosmic siege.
A cosmic siege. I like that. But we should probably point out that Edwards doesn't start with the whole cosmos.
Right. He doesn't. He starts where Paul started, with the very localized historical conflict.
Yeah, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. And the trigger for this entire letter, or at least this massive section of it, is skepticism about the resurrection.
People were actually doubting it.
Oh, heavily. There were factions in the ancient world aggressively opposing the idea that the dead could rise, which means we really need to look at the geographical and cultural reality of ancient Corinth.
Because if we want to understand Edwards' analysis of evil, we have to look at the specific people who are arguing with Paul.
Precisely. And Edwards highlights two historical groups. On one side, you have the Jewish Sadducees. The source material references Acts 23 to show their theology. They denied angels, they denied spirits, and they denied the resurrection entirely.
It was just a flat rejection of the supernatural afterlife.
Complete rejection. But then on the other side, you have the Greek philosophers. Corinth was geographically very close to Athens.
The intellectual capital of the ancient world.
Yeah, the hub.
Wow.
And that proximity meant philosophical ideas bled heavily into the local Corinthian church.
I think about it a lot like modern scientific materialism.
Well, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, because ancient Greek philosophical skepticism functioned in a very similar way. Both frameworks reject the bodily resurrection because it breaks their established rules for how the physical universe operates.
You can't unfry an egg.
Right, you just can't. In a closed material system, biological death is a one-way street. So the Greeks are looking at Paul and saying, your math does not work.
The equation is broken.
Yeah. Once the body dies, the material decomposes and it is gone forever. They actually mocked Paul when he preached this at the Areopagus in Athens.
They laughed at him. And Edwards suggests that the church at Corinth probably picked up this specific strain of corruption from the Greek philosophers rather than the Sadducees.
Just given that Corinth was such a major hub for Greek thinkers.
Yeah, it makes the most sense. But notice what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15. He doesn't just give them biological arguments. He expands the equation to include the entire cosmos.
He zooms way out.
Way out. Edwards shows us Paul's logical progression in three distinct phases. First, you have Christ's resurrection from the dead.
That initial breach in the wall of death.
Yeah, the first crack. Next, you have the resurrection of all the saints at the end of the world. And then follows the final phase, the delivery of the kingdom to God the Father after all enemies are subdued.
And the phrase Edwards locks onto here is, the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death.
It's such a heavy phrase.
It stands out so starkly. The last enemy. I mean, when I hear the word enemies, my mind immediately goes to hostile people.
Sure, rival armies, political opponents.
Yeah, personal adversaries. But Edwards is doing something different here. He argues that by enemies, Paul doesn't just mean persons who set themselves against God. He means evils.
Anything that opposes.
Right, whatever opposes Christ or his saints, whether they be persons or things. Death is not a person.
No, it's a condition.
It's a condition, a reality.
Yeah.
And it is categorized as an enemy.
And that shifts the entire battlefield. The victory isn't just about defeating a hostile army. It's about the destruction of hostile realities.
Kyle realities. That's good.
And this is the core foundation Edwards built upon. If enemies include all forms of evil, then we have to evaluate the entire hierarchy of those forces.
Which means we need to look at the top of the chain. If Satan is the architect, the grand master moving the pieces, then the Greeks might argue humanity is just a victim.
Right.
So we should move from the philosophical debate happening in the streets of Corinth to the absolute top of that hierarchy, Satan. Edwards treats Satan as the first category of evil.
And his description of Satan's origin is striking.
It really is. He notes that Satan was originally one of the highest rank of creatures.
Vastly superior in natural capacity and abilities to mankind.
And his fall came through pride. He became enamored with his own superior dignity and the glory his creator had given him.
Edwards specifically notes that Satan refused to submit to the Son of God. He attempted instead to exalt his own throne above him.
Which drew vast multitudes of the heavenly hosts into open rebellion.
Yeah, a massive defection. And after being cast out of heaven, his campaign moved directly to earth.
And the timeline Edwards lays out here is just relentless.
It doesn't stop.
No.
Yeah.
He causes the fall of our first parents, bringing ruin to the whole human race in both body and soul. Then he triggers this almost universal corruption that brings on the flood.
Wiping out almost everyone.
Right. And after the flood, Edwards says Satan darkened all the world with heathenism, setting himself up to be worshipped almost universally.
He even required child sacrifices from the nations.
It is a brutal campaign. I view it through the analogy of a chess grandmaster.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, you look at a chessboard, and there are multiple seemingly unrelated attacks happening across the board. A pawn moves here, a knight flanks over there. To a novice, it looks like separate, chaotic events.
Like, they aren't connected at all.
Yeah. But the Grandmaster is orchestrating all of it to corner a single king.
I see where you're going with the chess analogy, but I think it only gets us halfway there.
Why's that?
Because chess implies a clean, sterile game. Edwards views this as incredibly messy and bloody. It's less like a grandmaster moving wooden pieces and more like a biological virus mutating to infect every new civilization.
Oh, wow. Okay. A mutating virus.
Yeah, Edwards views all of human history as a single, unified theater of war. He doesn't see isolated political or religious movements. He sees a highly coordinated strategy orchestrated by an intellect vastly superior to our own.
So to Edwards, the Roman persecutions, the rise of rival empires, the spread of heresies, these aren't random historical accidents.
No, they are calculated moves to checkmate the kingdom of Christ. Edwards tracks this ongoing assault through the rise of historical empires and false religions.
He specifically mentions the kingdoms of Antichrist and Muhammad, right?
Yes, and also the promotion of modern atheism and infidelity. The entire goal is to obliterate the church. And this campaign peaks with his direct attacks on Christ.
Getting right to the source.
Yeah, Satan influenced men to hate and despise Christ throughout his life. And finally, he persuaded one of his own disciples, Judas, to betray him.
Procuring the crucifixion.
Which Edwards calls the most cruel and ignominious death unrestrained malice could devise.
Unrestrained malice. That's a heavy phrase. But Satan is an external adversary.
Right.
While he orchestrated the ruin, his primary victory was creating an internal catastrophe for humanity.
Yes, that internal ruin.
Edwards doesn't let mankind off the hook by painting us just as victims of a cosmic war. He turns the camera inward, right to the human soul.
Which brings us to Edwards' second and third categories of evil, guilt, and corruption.
And his description of guilt is terrifying. He forces us to look at the scale of it.
He really zooms in on the math.
He does. He says it's not just that some persons are guilty, but all people in all nations and all ages, and those who live any length of time aren't guilty of one sin, but of thousands and thousands of thousands.
The multiplier is insane.
It makes me think of a national debt that grows exponentially every single second. Imagine a ledger so massive, accumulating interest so rapidly that no human effort, no tax rate, no austerity measure could ever balance it.
The debt is structurally impossible to pay off.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. Structurally impossible.
And Edwards uses a very vivid physical metaphor to illustrate that precise point. He likens the guilt of the world to mountains heaped upon mountains.
Just piling up.
Piled so high they rise above the clouds and the stars of heaven. He says it transcends all account, all expression, all ability of numbers or measures. The world is loaded with it on every side.
Mountains reaching the stars. We really have to pause on the math here.
Yeah, let's break that down.
Why is guilt described as reaching the stars? Because Edwards is operating on the principle that the severity of an offense is measured by the dignity of the person offended.
Right. So sinning against an infinitely holy God incurs an infinite debt.
If guilt is infinite, humans cannot pay it because we are finite beings. We would have to pay it forever. Hence, the concept of eternal punishment.
The human mind can't even comprehend that scale.
We really can't, and that is just the guilt. Then he moves to the third category, corruption and wickedness of heart.
This is where it gets really dark.
He unpacks total depravity using Romans chapter 3. He says, every part is depraved.
He focuses heavily on the bodily metaphors Paul uses in Romans 3 to show how comprehensive this internal ruin is.
He notes the throat is an open sepulcher.
Yeah, an open grave. Just think about the stench of that imagery.
Oh man, yeah. And the tongues are used for deceit.
The poison of asps is under the lips.
The mouth is full of cursing, and the feet are swift to shed blood. Every single faculty and principle is infected.
The mind is darkened, the will is rebellious, the affections are disordered.
Think about the times you've tried to break a bad habit, like scrolling your phone late at night or losing your temper with a family member.
It's harder than it seems.
You realize very quickly you aren't fully in control of your own mind. Edwards has taken that universal human frustration and turning the dial up to 1,000.
Way up.
He calls it innate corruption, and he contrasts it with contracted habits of sin.
Meaning it's not just what we are born with.
Right. It's not just that we are born with the propensity to do wrong. We practice it. We refine it. We build cultures around it. We break down all restraints upon natural corruption through bad customs and education.
Just as he used the mountain metaphor for guilt, he uses a terrifying physical metaphor for corruption.
What does he compare it to?
He likens it to a great and universal deluge that overtops all things.
A flood?
Yeah, a flood that prevails with the strength of the raging waves of a tempestuous ocean, ready to bear down all before it.
So you have mountains of guilt reaching to the stars and an ocean of corruption drowning the earth.
The internal state of mankind is a total disaster area.
It's a wasteland. And this internal ruin inevitably produces a hostile external world.
Of course it does.
If the heart is an ocean of corruption, the societies built by those hearts will reflect that chaos. Which leads us to the final three categories of evil Edwards identifies.
The devil's instruments, affliction, and death.
Let's look at the devil's instruments first. We see these instruments prospering and rising to the head of great kingdoms with vast riches and mighty force.
Edwards points to the 4 great heathen monarchies from Daniel's prophecies.
Right, the statue.
Yeah, kingdoms set up in direct opposition to the kingdom of Christ. He specifically highlights the Roman Empire, describing it with great iron teeth that devoured broken pieces and stamped the residue with its feet.
This was the empire that made a business of tormenting and destroying Christians with the full might of its state apparatus.
The external world became a machine designed to crush the saints.
And from those mighty instruments of state authority, Edwards transitions into the everyday afflictions of humanity.
The daily grind of suffering.
Yeah, spiritual and physical misery. He mentions the intolerable weight of a wounded spirit and a guilty conscience, the spiritual darkness that can overtake people.
But he says affliction peaked. It reached its absolute zenith in Christ's bloody sweat in the garden.
Gethsemane.
Yes. Affliction exalted itself so high that it seized the Son of God, overwhelming his soul in an ocean of sorrow.
Which logically brings us to the final, ultimate enemy, death.
The last enemy.
Edwards scrutinizes death as an evil that has made dreadful havoc. He calls it a great, insatiable monster that devours all mankind, sparing no one.
High or low, rich or poor, good or bad, death devours all.
Even the bodies of the saints fall prey to this devourer. And this circles us back to the initial context of the Corinthians' skepticism.
Right, the Greeks.
Death is the ultimate physical proof of the reign of evil. Every grave is a physical argument that evil has won the day.
It's hard to argue with a tombstone.
It really is. When Edwards describes death swallowing Christ, I cannot help but picture an apex predator.
Like a lion.
More like a great white shark that devours everything in the ocean. It's massive, unstoppable, and terrifying. But one day, it finally swallows a stick of dynamite.
I see.
The very act of feeding is what blows it apart. Death rose so high that it took hold of Christ himself. His bodily frame was destroyed and laid in the dark, silent grave. But the consumption became the destruction.
This raises a massive theological question, and it is the pivot point of Edwards' entire argument.
Okay, lay it out.
While having stacked the enemy forces to towering heights, Satan, infinite guilt, total corruption, mighty empires, and death, how does Christ actually conquer this mountain of evil?
That is the big question.
The narrative shifts from the scale of the ruin to the paradox of victory. Edwards says this victory is secured in Christ's state of humiliation.
Let's break down the mechanics here. Because logically, people ask, how does a few hours of physical and spiritual suffering on a cross equal an infinite payment?
It's a common question.
Because we established earlier that the debt is infinite because it's against an infinite God.
Right. And Edwards relies on the mechanism of substitution. Christ is an infinite being. So when an infinite person suffers, the value of that suffering is infinite.
So it scales perfectly.
Yes. It covers the infinite debt in a matter of hours. The math finally balances. He offered a sacrifice sufficient for the whole world, and he purchased holiness for the chief of sinners.
And Edwards uses this incredible phrase here. He says, he slew Satan with his own weapon. The spiritual David cut off this Goliath's head with his own sword.
That is brilliant tactical analysis by Edwards.
It really is. Satan, that old serpent, used an immense amount of subtlety to procure Christ's death. Satan thought he had obtained a complete victory.
He thought he had won the chess match.
He thought it was checkmate. But he was ignorant of the contrivance of redemption. The wisdom of Christ ordered things so that Satan's subtlety and malice became the very means of undermining the foundations of his own kingdom.
Jesus wisely led Satan into the pit that Satan himself had dug.
The irony is just incredible. The irony that evil, in exerting its maximum force, exhausts itself against infinite purity and merit.
The cross is where the iron teeth of Rome and the malice of Satan do their absolute worst, yet it functions as the engine of victory.
Yes, the engine of victory. Edwards dwells on the imagery for the atonement overcoming guilt. We talked about guilt being like mountains reaching the stars, right?
Yes, the impossible mountains.
Edwards says Christ's dying love and merit are like an immense fountain of light.
A fountain of light.
And the fullness and redundancy of its brightness swallows up men's greatest sins the way the full beam of the sun swallows a tiny dust mote.
Wow. That imagery is staggering.
It really puts it in perspective. You have a mountain of guilt, but when you place it next to the infinite merit of Christ, it looks like a speck of dust in sunlight.
The cross is where the infinite debt meets an infinite payment. In dying, Christ became the plague and destruction of death. When death slew him, it slew itself.
But a hidden victory on a cross requires public vindication.
Nobody knew he won right at that moment.
Exactly. I mean, yes, spot on. We have to move from the mechanism of the victory to its undeniable display in history, which brings us to the exaltation.
Edwards details Christ's resurrection and ascension as the moment he appears gloriously above all evil. Death, which Edwards now calls the Leviathan, is forced to vomit Christ up.
The grave couldn't hold him.
In his resurrection, Christ was justified, appearing above all guilt and affliction. When he ascended into heaven, he rose far above the reach of the devil and his instruments, sitting at the right hand of God.
And Edwards uses some striking Old Testament parallels here to illustrate this point, doesn't he?
He does. He examines the story of Dagon, the Philistine idol.
Oh, I love that story.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant was captured and placed in the temple of Dagon. But the next morning, the idol of Dagon was found fallen face down before the ark.
Just flat on its face.
Right. And they set it back up, and the following morning it was fallen again. But this time, its head and hands were broken off.
Just completely severed.
Yeah. And Edwards uses this as a representation of death falling broken before Christ. The head, representing wisdom and authority, and the hands, representing might, are completely severed.
That is a brilliant connection. He also analyzes the prophecies of Daniel, too.
With King Nebuchadnezzar.
Right. The king has a dream of a great statue representing the empires of the world. Gold, silver, bronze, iron. But a stone cut without hands strikes the feet of the statue, smashing it to pieces.
And the wind carries the pieces away like chaff.
Yes, and the stone grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth. Edwards connects this to Christ's ongoing providence in history.
Christ upholds the church through all the attempts by earth and hell to destroy it.
Against all odds, really.
Edwards highlights the rapid spread of the gospel overtaking the Roman Empire. The philosophers in Corinth and Athens, the wise men and the emperors united all their force to stop it, but the gospel overthrew Satan's heathenish kingdom in a very short time.
He also points to the historical Reformation recovering the church from popery and the future fall of Antichrist.
It's an ongoing campaign.
I think of this like a decisive military beachhead. Look at D-Day in World War II.
Okay, the invasion of Normandy.
Yeah. The outcome of the entire war is technically secured on those beaches. The decisive victory has been won. The enemy's back is broken.
Even though there's still a lot of fighting left.
Right. The rest of history, what Edwards calls providence, is the systematic pushing back of the enemy forces until the entire map is reclaimed. The Leviathan is broken, Dagon's hands are snapped off, and now the stone is growing into a mountain.
But Edwards never leaves his theology in the abstract realm of history or grand military metaphors.
He brings it down to the individual.
Yeah, the victory must arrive in the human soul. This brings us to the application of internal grace and the final consummation.
And Edwards describes conversion in very combative terms.
He says the strong man armed is overcome. All his armor is taken from him.
The lamb is taken right out of the mouth of the lion and the bear.
A heart of stone turns to flesh.
Christ's grace comes over the mountains of their sins. This is not a gentle persuasion. This is a rescue mission behind enemy lines.
It's a hostile extraction. And then Edwards moves to the consummation at the end of the world. He says the whole work of redemption will be completed regarding interpretation and application.
Wrapping everything up.
All devils and their instruments will be brought before Christ, judged, and cast into the lake of fire, shut up forever.
All guilt, corruption, affliction, sighs, and tears will be eternally abolished.
And we get to this amazing statement about death. In glorifying departed saints, death is turned from an enemy into a servant.
A servant.
Yeah. The soul is exalted to a state where it is perfectly delivered from temptation, corruption, and affliction. Death becomes a resurrection for the soul.
Let's pause on that idea, because that is huge.
It really is.
How does this framework alter a person's view of mortality? If death has been demoted from an insatiable monster to a servant whose only job is to escort the believer to glory, how should that affect the daily anxieties you carry?
I mean, it completely defangs the monster.
It does. If the worst thing that can happen to you, physical death, has been repurposed into a chauffeur that drives you into eternal joy, the baseline panic of human existence starts to dissolve.
You no longer have to live in fear of the Greek philosopher's closed material system.
Which sets up Edwards' conclusion perfectly.
Bringing it all home.
Having traced this timeline from eternity past to eternity future, he lands on his practical takeaways for his congregation, offering what he calls extreme encouragement.
Christ is the true Michael fighting the dragon.
No matter how high guilt rises, even towering up to the stars, Christ is exalted above it. If you are sinking in a deluge of woe, Christ is above the deluge.
Believers are carried on eagle's wings high out of the reach of all evils.
Edwards makes a fascinating aesthetic argument here. He says the beauty of good appears with the greatest advantage when compared with its contrary.
He argues that the sheer magnitude of evil, its terrifying height and depth, is permitted specifically to act as a dark foil.
The darker the background, the brighter the glory of Christ's redemption shines.
He points out that Christ, who appeared as a little child and a man of sorrows, triumphed over the most gigantic enemies in their greatest might, using the despicable instrument of the cross.
The math of redemption is infinite.
Edwards argues that no matter how multiplied your sins are, no matter how strong the contracted habits of corruption, or how fierce the devil's buffetings, Christ has already demonstrated his supremacy over the absolute worst manifestations of these evils.
It is like standing at the bottom of a massive canyon. The deeper the canyon of sin, misery, and historical ruin, the higher you have to look to see the summit of Christ's victory.
It makes the rescue so much more staggering.
If he conquered the ocean of corruption and the mountains of guilt on the cross, the specific sins of an individual person are easily swallowed up like that dust mote in the beam of the sun.
There is no depth you can sink to that the foundation of his victory has not already gone deeper than.
That is the core of Edwards' message to his listeners.
That's the extreme encouragement.
So we're going to leave you with a final thought to chew on. If Edwards is correct that every single manifestation of evil, whether a personal tragedy, a systemic injustice, or a massive historical catastrophe, will conclusively be put under his feet and made to display Christ's glory.
How does that reframe things for you?
Right. How does that reframe the way you consume the daily news or view your own personal struggles? Does it change despair into a waiting period for the inevitable victory? Thank you for joining Reformed Thinking for this deep dive into Edwards. Let that idea sit with you until next time.